Hello, I'm Darrin Magee. I'm Director of the Institute for Energy Studies at Western Washington University, and today I get to introduce myself. I'm thrilled to be part once more of this speaker series that is hosted by the Institute for Energy Studies and by the Foundation for Western and the alumni. Today I will be talking about China, a fascinating place that I have studied for a few decades. I first went to China in the early 90s and decided I wanted to study resource issues there, natural resource issues there, and landed on water and energy questions kind of in the late 90s, and then did my PhD at University of Washington on large-scale hydropower in southwestern China on transboundary rivers. So specifically on the upper Mekong River and the upper Salween River. Those are two transboundary rivers that start in China. Half of the Mekong is in China. The first half of the Mekong is in China. The second half flows through which five countries? Anybody got one of them? Cambodia, they all said in unison. Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Myanmar. Good, good. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the way I've titled my talk is all of the above, China's race to build the energy system of tomorrow. And when I started studying hydropower in China in the early 2000s, really in earnest, China was really starting to push at building a national grid, a nationwide electrical grid. There were two main grid companies around the country, and then thousands of local grids, really just wires strung up between small scale generators and a few houses, some small factories, that sort of thing. The amount of build out that China has done in the past couple of decades in generation transmission is staggering. So with that, we'll get started. We often think of China in superlatives, right? It's the 1/5 ballpark of the world's population, second largest economy, biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, world's greatest hydropower potential by far. That's kind of a nerdy one, but one that I've been looking at for a long time. China is responsible for roughly half the world's coal consumption. China has half the world's large dams. Anybody want to guess at how many that is? When I say large dam, I mean 15 meters and taller. There are a lot of ways to define a large dam, but if we use that definition, roughly 50 feet high, and I tell you, China has roughly half the world's large dams. About how many would you think that would be? 200, says one brave soul. What else? 2,000, up in order of magnitude. I'll see your 200 and raise you a 2,000. What else? I mean, that's a crazy number of large dams. These are large dams, not just dams, large dams. Crazy? 25,000. China has 25,000 ballpark large dams in the country, right? 25. In 1949, it had two. Two. Not 2,000, two. So it just gives you an idea of the speed of the build out of massive infrastructure in China, right, over the past 3/4 of a century. In just that one flavor. The bridge we're looking at here is in southwestern China's Guizhou province, a very rural, remote, very poor, I think the poorest on average province in China, per capita at least. That bridge was part of a major infrastructure push to bring economic development to parts of rural China that had not seen it. That bridge is 635 meters above the river below it. So do that math, roughly, I don't know, a third of a mile. Is that right? Yeah. Crazy for barbarian units. So China has half the world's solar power and growing, the greatest installed renewables capacity, and lots of big bridges, as I said. A century in that country, in China, a century anywhere, but a century in China makes a huge difference. So just looking back to 1925, China was in the midst of an internal war. What we know of as China, Imperial China, had ended in 1911 with the fall of the Qing dynasty. And then for a couple of decades, there were various factions around the country and external powers fighting for control of this massive landmass that over the centuries and over the millennia really had shrunken and grown in size as various dynasties had controlled the territory. One of my favorite moments when I was in Mongolia one time, a few years back, I met a Chinese man, and he sort of sweeps his arm across towards in the direction of the north, across Mongolia, and he says to me in Chinese, he was excited that I could speak Chinese, and he says to me, you know, look at this, all of this used to be China. And because if you look back to the maps during Qing Dynasty and earlier times when what we now call Mongolia, that's now drawn at certain points in history that was drawn into the map of China. And I very deliberately turned towards the south and I said, well, actually, all of that towards China was conquered by the Mongols, of course, because it was Genghis Khan who went south, not the Chinese who went north. But anyway, so 1925 was a very fractured, fraught, devastating period for China. The population, roughly a third of what it is now. The Communist Party of China, Chinese Communist Party, had just been born in Shanghai in 1921. There were 0 large dams at that point. And there were massive shocks to come during the Maoist period. The Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, early 60s, the Cultural Revolution from late 60s to mid 70s, right, that saw massive periods of dislocation, stagnation, and starvation in China. Fast forward a century, Xi Jinping is in his 3rd term and will continue to be in power for as long as he wants. I will bet on that one. Population of 1.3 billion. The CCP has been solidly in power for nearly a century now, since 1949. And part of that has been because they have been able to claim responsibility for massive economic development that's happened across the country. The dams I mentioned, 25,000 large dams. And we have, at least in the perspective of many of my geopolitics colleagues and IR colleagues, an ascendant China that poses a fundamental challenge to the existing world order and what may have at least one point been the Washington consensus based on a rules-based world order. So where does energy fit in all this? Energy is economic development. Energy is investment, investment, investment. Lots of it, right? The industry is a major player in China's GDP, roughly a third of GDP, and clean energy probably 10% of GDP. Much bigger numbers than the United States. The energy intensity of China's GDP, that is how many joules or how many kilowatt hours of energy it takes to produce a unit of GDP, is dropping and continues to drop. That's what the bottom graph there shows. That's a measure of how efficient an economy is, basically.
Hey,
There's
Darrin.
still, yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your slides.
Oh, gosh, I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Let
Thank
me,
you.
thank you. Sorry, people online. Let me fix that. Share screen. Really sorry about that. I'm gonna hide this. Where'd you go? Hide floating media. Okay. Really disappointed that those of you online weren't able to make up these slides as I was going along, just from the description, but no, sorry about that. I could see them just fine in here. Uh, but a reminder, there's, as I said a minute ago, that the government has been able to claim the responsibility and leadership for this period of rapid economic development that China's seen. And that has been largely coal-fired prosperity, right? So if you look back to the main energy source that has powered China's rise, it has been dead dinosaurs in rock form. It has, fossil fuels in rock form. China has spent a lot of decades turning coal into air to power that industrial growth. Energy, social well-being. So that coal-fired prosperity started to lead to some real impacts in terms of air pollution that became super visible in the late aughts, early 2010s. And one of you sent a question in actually a while ago is, how much of China's push to renewables is driven by economic development strategy versus pollution control? And I'd say yes, meaning both of those have been fundamentally important. In the early 2010s, China had crazy bad air days. I have crazy bad hair days once in a while, but crazy bad air days where you literally land. I remember landing in Beijing. My colleagues in here probably remember that as well, Froy. Landing in Beijing at certain points and not being able to see the end of the wing on the plane. Not necessarily the end of the run, but the end of the wing on the plane. The air was that bad. And so in 2010 or so, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing had a Twitter feed, had air quality monitors on the roof of the embassy, had a Twitter feed, and it turns out that a lot of Beijing residents started paying attention to that Twitter feed and looking at those air quality readings and kind of making a stink about it and deciding, I'm not going to go out today if the air is off the charts unhealthy. Beijing leadership said, this is just American propaganda shaming China. And then about, I don't know, a month later, they said, actually, it is pretty bad. And the Beijing government started producing its own data, different scale. One was air pollution index, one was air quality index, different index, but the same pollutants sort of weighing into that index. And both told a similar story that, whoa, this is bad news and it's a potential threat to social stability. And if you're an authoritarian government that claims that your party is the only one that has the right to rule, the last thing you want to deal with is widespread social instability. It's one thing to have social instability out in the rural areas because of polluted water, polluted soil, polluted air. It's another thing for the economic and political elite in the cities to say, holy crap, it's too bad to go outside today or next week or the next 2 weeks, right? So the Chinese government did what the Chinese government can do and made major investments in improving that air quality by shutting down a lot of the worst polluters, moving them out of the city. Water pollution also widespread. In the early 2000s, rolling blackouts, especially even in industrial powerhouse portions of China in the southeast, were fairly common. Those are no longer an issue. And I'll show a little bit more why in a minute. In the early 2000s, it was also it was a different time in China. The government was more willing to report data that didn't necessarily tell a good story, that everything was hunky-dory in China. And so in 2006, they reported that there were 75,000 official stats, 75,000 or so mass incidents, so protests in the street across China. Next year, 90,000. And there are two responses when the trend is going that way. You either fix those social stability problems or you stop reporting the data, right? So 2008, there was no data. Works pretty well. Energy, what else is energy? Energy is technological gain. I mentioned spillovers from the energy industry into other adjacent industries. Technological transfer. I've got a colleague, Joanna Lewis, in DC, who did a great book on tech transfer in the wind power sector. China for decades has used a model. Chinese companies have used a model of a joint venture where they partner with outside companies to develop technology in China. Sometimes that's led to illicit technology transfer that foreign companies complain about a lot. Many other times it's led to technology transfer that is baked into the contract. In both cases, it has led to China being able to indigenize a lot of the technologies, whether it's AI, solar power, wind power, rare earth refining. I mean, we had those tech transfer, those technology study tours in the 1960s when U.S. rare earth refining companies were showing Chinese partners, Chinese engineers, how to do it, basically. Now China controls 97% or so of rare earth refining in the world, right? Of the world's rare earth refining capacity. China has not dialed back investment in STEM education, has not pulled back funding for energy research, has not pulled back basic science funding. Indeed, it has gone the other way. Energy's geopolitical and trade leverage, and boy, what a better time to talk about that. What better time to talk about that than right now after the events of the weekend? China, unlike the United States, is a big-time net petroleum importer, dependent on imports for roughly 70% of its petroleum use. Now, it uses about half of the petroleum on a daily basis that the United States uses, about 10 billion ballpark, 10 million barrels a day, million with an M, rather than roughly 20 for the US. But a lot of those liquid hydrocarbons are imported. And interestingly enough, China will almost certainly feel the impacts of the war in Iran that started this weekend, much more than we will, at least in the short term. That's probably not an accident. I mentioned that China controls a lot of rare earth minerals processing technology, and they have been willing to deploy that as a threat in geopolitical spats before. So in 2010, there was an incident where over some islands that lie between between Taiwan and Japan, the Senkaku Islands in Japanese, or the Diaoyu in Chinese, and there was an incident where a boat captain was arrested by the Japanese, I think, for trespassing on what the Japanese considered to be territorial waters. And the Chinese cut off rare earth supplies to Japan like that. And everybody said, whoa, well, they can't do that. And yes, indeed they could. And it made all of Japan's automakers and high-tech high-tech manufacturers, users of those materials sit up and sort of realize that something had shifted geopolitically, right? So energy is part of that geopolitical leverage. The Belt and Road Initiative, so this is Xi Jinping's signature overseas investment initiative since 2013 when he came to power, has brought major investments across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, partly to secure access to resources, including oil, maybe say in Venezuela. That might have been an important reason for all that partnership between China and Venezuela. Partly to build the capacity of Chinese companies, whether they're making railroads, making fertilizer, whether they're making roads, whether they're making hydroelectric dams, to get that technological expertise out there, and building that infrastructure around the world. And increasingly, including right now, China's leadership is trying to bill China as the responsible global player on the international stage right now. Yeah. This is a slide I just added. How does the war in Iran affect China? So roughly, this is from some data at Politico. Roughly 17% of China's oil came from Venezuela and Iran last year. And more importantly are the light blue bars on the left side here. On the horizontal bars, all the light blue indicates sources of oil headed to China that will be affected by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that very narrow passageway through which a significant amount of Gulf oil passes. And that light blue is reflected in the right side slide as well. So, 20+% of China's oil at risk of being seriously constrained because of this conflict. So what has this meant for China's energy strategy? I'll back up a little bit and just give you context. The Chinese economic planners, and you say, what? Yes, planners. China has a 5-year plan tradition. They're currently in the 14th 5-year plan, I think. I should know this, I'm almost certain. That's going from 2026. Yeah, so usually the plans come out early 2026 or 2031. And those are macro plans set from the NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission. It used to be 70 years ago, 80 years ago, the State Planning Commission. This is inherited from Soviet-style economic development. NDRC later changed name from State Planning Commission to National Development Reform Commission. And basically, this is a way that the central government sets signals for what it prioritizes for economic development over the next 5 years. And that trickles down to provinces and to cities and to factories and to villages, all the way down. And every official throughout Chinese government officialdom will be evaluated at how well they're doing, adhering to the targets set by the 5-year plan. So the one of those plans one of those targets from the current plan is peak carbon emissions by 2030. That's pretty awesome. That's right around the corner. Would it have been better if they peaked in 2020? Sure. We don't have a peak carbon emissions plan in this country. I hate to say. Carbon neutrality by 2060. Okay, that's pretty bold. It could be bolder. But that's been around for about 10 years now. That target, Xi Jinping set that early in his administration. New coal. So despite the exciting renewable story that I'll tell in a minute, China continues to build a lot of coal-fired power plants. The best ones on the planet, the worst ones they tore down during the 12th 5-year plan. They tore down about an England worth of old coal-fired power plants. But they're still building new. The U.S. has 172 ballpark total gigawatts of coal-fired power right now. China built that much, built 100 gigawatts, sorry, alone in 2024 alone. So again, give you an idea of the scale at which building is happening. While using that coal, so China imports a lot of petroleum, it doesn't have to import coal, it actually does import coal. From us and from Australia, primarily. Why would they do that, you ask? Why would China import coal if it's got centuries of its own coal? Trade deals? Reasonable guess?
They don't want to destroy their own country's landscape.
They don't want to destroy their own country's landscape? Reasonable guess? Keep a stockpile in reserve, reasonable guess. China's coal is higher sulfur, lower energy on average than Western US coal, than Australian coal. And crazy enough, it's faster and cheaper and more reliable to get, maybe not faster, cheaper and more reliable to get coal by ship to China from Australia or from the west coast of the United States than it is to get coal across China by road or train sometime, more predictable. There was, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, this famous 12-day traffic jam in China, eastern China, resulting from coal trucks hauling a bunch of coal because the rail lines were so clogged. Anyway, so lots of coal still going, but at the same time, full speed ahead on renewables. I'll tell that story in a minute. Ultra high voltage DC transmission lines, China is building them. I don't know, the numbers are just staggering, but these are 1,100 kilovolts now transmission lines. I don't even know how many thousand kilometers have been built, but it is in the thousands of kilometers that have been rolled out over the past 10 decades, decade. Over much of this to solve a fundamental geographic problem of the power generation resources being hydropower, sun, wind being way out in the west, and a lot of the demand centers being in the east. So energy security is a national security question as well. Coal is unfortunately still burning. I mentioned that. So the big fat wedge there on the left side represents total energy consumption by source. The largest wedge there is coal use, so not shrinking as a total energy resource just yet. The good news on the right slide is that the use of coal to generate electricity is indeed coming down, but still a lot of coal happening. Early 2000s saw a lot of growth in renewables capacity. but not necessarily in terms of renewables actually contributing to electricity numbers, actual generated electricity. So there are a lot of wind farms that went up, especially wind farms that went up, because local governments were incentivized to build wind farms, and yet the grid companies were not incentivized to connect to them. And while there were paper penalties that they would theoretically have to pay a penalty if they didn't connect, those penalties were rarely, if ever, enforced. That situation's gone right now. Every wind turbine that's been built is connected to the grid, is producing electricity. The growth in actual output, if you look on the slide here, it's a bit covered up here in the class. See if I can change that. But the growth in solar, the yellow line here, the growth in wind have been quite impressive over the past decade. Hydro really took off in the first couple of decades of the 2000s, now kind of flattening out, but still happening. And again, the scale of deployment of hydro in China, quite impressive. Wind is a big, let's see, wind is quite an interesting story. In terms of the 5-year plans. I missed it by one. We're now in the 15th 5-year plan. During the last 5-year plan, the Chinese government set a target, the National Development Reform Commission, the Energy Research Institute set a target of 50 gigawatts per year. They actually beat that every year by 10, on average, by 10 gigawatts a year. So in 2026 to 2030, the current 5-year plan, they've doubled that. They said, well, let's do 120 gigawatts a year. Staggering amounts of wind power being deployed across the country. Aiming for 1.3 terawatts by 2030, 2 terawatts by 2035. I mean, at this point, the amount of wind installed starts to outpace or out install every source of electricity the United States has. Right? Roughly the same size country, landmass, but we're looking at a situation over the next decade where China has more wind power installed than we have everything. Just mind-boggling. This includes some very big offshore wind capacity, and I just had to laugh at this biggest wind turbine ever piece that I pulled off the web there, off of everybody's favorite source for Avi Cohen, everybody's favorite source for energy news on China. What do you see that's wrong with this wind turbine? Alex, what you got? Right, they're 4 blades, one's a lot smaller than each other, and you wouldn't put them in that kind of configuration if you wanted the thing to spin normally, right? The photo is clearly AI slop, right? So don't believe, I know this is a shocker, don't believe everything you read on the interwebs. Once in a while you get some real garbage that comes out. EVs, a crazy story in China. I'll keep coming back to that petroleum imports number. Anybody, so depending on how much of imports, depending on imports for how much of their electricity, for petroleum? 70%, right? Dependent on imports for how much of their electricity do you think? 0%. 0%. Where does petroleum go primarily as an energy use? What sector? For transportation, vehicles, right? So real incentive to make sure that your transportation sector is not built to be dependent for generations on burning liquid dead dinosaurs, right? Burning petroleum. Real incentive to make sure that your transportation sector is electrified wherever possible, including heavy trucks. And remember that thing about bad air that I talked about a while ago? All these big heavy trucks that are going in and out of cities, medium and large trucks going in and out of cities, very populated, heavily populated cities, right, contributing to local air quality issues in those cities. If all of a sudden those trucks, which are burning low quality, high sulfur diesel, many of them very, very, very old trucks, are replaced by a lot of electric trucks, then you will see immediate air quality benefits in the cities, right? So win, win, win. I mean, it's like 7 wins all piled up there. And China is taking this very seriously. There's a reason that US EV manufacturers are desperate to keep Chinese electric vehicles out of this country. They're good, they're fast, they harvest all of our data and give it to the CC. Did I say that? They did. They do that. They have ridiculously efficient battery charging capabilities, and the Chinese EV makers have also been very successfully doing some battery swapping technology, which sort of kind of was a thing for a little bit here, but just in the way that we can't agree on USB or USB-C or USB Pi or whatever, and Mac dongle versus PC dongles and everything. That didn't happen in this country. China's got EV swapping for 18-wheelers. So rather than stand there and wait for your 18-wheeler, your heavy truck to charge, battery swapping, wait for your heavy battery to charge, heavy truck battery to charge. You pull into a charging station, a crane lifts it out, moves it over into a charging dock, puts a new battery in, and off you go. In the time it takes to go inside, get a coffee, get a tea, get a bite to eat, you're on the road again with Willie Nelson. Sorry, couldn't help. Despite being kept out of the largest automobile market in the United States, the largest automobile market in the world, aside from China, the U.S., China's EV makers are responsible for roughly 60% of global EV sales. So and they control the battery technology, right? And the rare earths. I mean, long game. Transmission capacity. I mentioned wires. China's building a lot of wires. You could not pay me enough money to be one of those guys up there on that wire. Just couldn't do it. I'm not doing that job. There's a reason I'm an academic. This has been going on for 25 years. In 1999, former Premier Zhu Rongji, I think it was at the time, said, we're going to start this Open Up the West, Xibu Da Kaifa, this great Open Up the West campaign. And all of these little sub-campaigns that went under it with things like Xi Dian Dong Song, Western electricity send to the East. And they even had one that's Western tobacco send to the East. You know, in the way that the Chinese government is uniquely good at making up silly slogans. But part of that, the Xi Dian Dong Song, the Western electricity East piece, was about building out significant transmission infrastructure capable of moving all those electrons from the hydropower build out in the West to load centers in the East. There was a time, a short 15, 20 minutes or so, in 2016, not quite that short, where there was a lot of overcapacity in terms of electricity production in the Southwest. At least seasonally, when there was a lot of water flowing in the monsoon season, so late spring, early summer, a lot of hydroelectric generation happening at that point. There wasn't enough demand for that electricity regionally, but that has changed now. AI data centers, even though the Chinese government came out and shut down Bitcoin operations in Western China that were taking advantage of this cheap, abundant, underutilized hydropower, they are all in on new and improved data centers for AI. And their own versions of Bitcoin as well. Hydro, I mentioned 25,000 large dams, many are on transboundary rivers. China's got a lot of transboundary rivers, some of them very big, some of them much smaller. Downstream countries are concerned about things like sediment trapping. You know, whenever you build a dam and you slow down the water in the river, that river drops its sediment, and the water that comes out of the dam afterwards, either through the turbines or through the spillway, is a lot cleaner. I mean, it's sediment poor, which means it's much more likely to erode the channel and the banks downstream. So they're concerned about erosion. They're concerned about Chinese dam operators withholding water during the dry season. If you're 5 countries downstream, like we said a while ago, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, in the dry season, if Chinese dams are filling on the upper Mekong, then that might mean more acute water shortages downstream. And then large dams on transboundary rivers also do something. They tend to flatten. Well, large dams on any rivers, they tend to flatten the hydrograph when there's seasonal variations due to monsoons. And so when those summer rains come and send that big flood pulse down the river, if you've got a bunch of dams storing water at that point, that flood pulse gets less pronounced, and the ecological impacts that flood pulse has served, or function that flood pulse has served for millennia, it gets out of whack. That's the technical term for it, out of whack. So I'll just move along because I'm talking too much here. Solar, I mentioned solar a lot. That's a huge story as well. A terawatt a year of China's solar companies producing panels. The amount of electric solar PV panels that Chinese producers can produce is roughly a terawatt a year. Current installed solar, kind of like the wind story, roughly equivalent to everything that the US has. Yeah, question in the back. That is not AI generated. That's a real photo. That's a fair question. But there are the scale of solar farms in the United States, I'm sorry, in China, can be quite shocking to those of us used to seeing, solar on a rooftop or something around here. One way to keep it, kind of put it in perspective, is that during the time of this talk, Chinese solar developers will cover an area roughly the size of this campus with solar panels. Right? As a guy who put 50 solar panels on my barn and know what kind of work that took, it's kind of mind-boggling. All of this is kind of mind-boggling. The solar story, you've probably heard part of this in the past, that it's not all roses and photovoltaic unicorns. There are a lot of companies that have been pushed out of business. There's a race to the bottom in terms of pricing. There's a race to the bottom in terms of environmental protections for mining and refining these minerals that go into producing solar panels. There's certainly a race to the bottom in terms of disposing of those panels in the most cost-effective way. Recycling of them, it is not something that is easy in China or the United States, anywhere really right now. There are a handful of companies that are trying desperately to figure out how to cost-effectively recycle the things like solar panels and batteries, as you heard from a couple of other speakers. It's quite complex and quite expensive right now. At the request of a certain geothermal colleague in the room, I added a slide on geothermal energy in China when boring isn't boring, direct heat in China. And indeed, it is quite an interesting story. So China has roughly 80 gigawatts of direct geothermal district heat. I did not have time to compare this to what world figures are like in terms of district district heat. Definitely the world. Okay, so I'm hearing from my geothermal colleague, definitely the world leader by a big margin in terms of geothermal heat. Just recently, like 2 weeks ago, China National Petroleum Corporation announced that it's got the largest enclosed structure heated by a single geothermal unit, 10,000 square meter structure. So like massive airplane hangar, like 1 kilometer by 10 kilometers long, 2 kilometers by 5 kilometers. I mean, serious amount of space under where the space conditioning is done by extracting heat from the ground. Not surprisingly, kind of like here, a lot of that drilling expertise lies in the oil exploration world, oil and gas exploration world. So you see companies like China National Petroleum Corporation and Sinopec getting heavily involved. I found this one article on the right here Forget it. The deepest geothermal well, so 5,200 meters, like what, 3 miles and change deep. And unfortunately, the interest that, I mean, so you got to be getting some really good potential for heating at that depth. Unfortunately, this happened in Hainan province, which doesn't need heating ever. Hainan is off the southern coast of China. It's very hot there. Yes, that heat might be useful for other purposes. It was an exploration well, but I found it ironic that it was in one of the coldest parts, or I'm sorry, one of the hottest parts of China. That said, there seem to be very good geothermal resources out in far western China, where the temperatures are much colder in general. I mentioned AI and EVs and electrification of things like heating and whatnot as some of the drivers for electricity demand growth in the United States. Same in China. So whereas 10 years ago, the Chinese government put the kibosh on sort of unregulated data center development that was taking place out west, trying to tap into very cheap hydroelectricity. They have not done the same with AI, and China is really pushing AI development and making sure it has enough electricity to power that AI development, power that mobility, that electric mobility. So that, you know, the biggest constraint, you may have read about this, for AI development in the United States, aside from ridiculously expensive chips, is electricity. Will continue to be electricity for a while. That will not be a constraint in China. U.S. has tried to limit export, at least did under the Biden administration, limit the exports of the most advanced chips. The Trump administration has dialed those back, those export controls back, and has allowed all but the very most recent chip models out of NVIDIA and friends to go to China. I won't spend any more time on that. So how's China done it? This responds to another question that somebody had in the post before the class. You know, this is an authoritarian government, right? This is not a democratic system, and so the 5-year plans do matter. It's very different economy than it was in the 40s and the 50s, when during the Maoist period, certainly. But those 5-year plans and those signals that come from the highest levels of government, and more importantly, the investment that follows, do matter a lot. So top-down decision-making gets a lot of things done. There's no such thing as eminent domain. Well, there is eminent domain. It's all eminent domain. No such thing as private land ownership in China. So I can own my house, and I can have a 99-year lease on the dirt below it, but I don't own the dirt below it. And so most of the time, if the dirt is the land is nationally owned, or in rural areas owned by the collectives, by the villages, so it is much easier to do things like build transmission lines. Whereas in the United States, that often comes down to brutal fights, long drawn out fights between lawyers and communities, lawyers, but for different actors in communities where those transmission lines might be set up, who have different perspectives on how that development should take place, right? I don't want a 30 kV transmission line in my backyard. It should go in his backyard or your backyard. Is that a question?
Yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, how do they deal with the people that were living in the dirt that they live now?
Resettlement. So yep, they move them. The question was, what about the people living who have to be moved for infrastructure projects? Yeah. So the first time this really hit the news in the international news was with Three Gorges project, which so you know, the biggest dam in China, that displaced, you know, 1 million to 1.5 million people. It created a 400-mile long lake on the middle stretches of the Yangtze River. It flooded a lot of villages. It flooded some historic sites. It flooded things that Tang Dynasty poets had written about, and things that will remain flooded for centuries. And those people were resettled. Some of the dams I was studying in Yunnan province in the southwest, similar thing. You'd have, displacing far fewer people to the tune of 50,000 people, right? Still a lot of people, some projects that would displace a Vermont. I mean, imagine taking everybody in Vermont and saying, sorry, you got to move because we're building something here in Vermont and we're going to flood Vermont, you know? The compensation schemes, I have one photo that I don't have it in this slide deck, but the compensation schemes were historically bad. There was historically corruption by mid-level managers or officials who were siphoning off those funds destined for villagers who were being resettled. And so by the time the money got down to the villagers, there was hardly any left. I remember doing an interview one time with a woman who was shaking her fist at me. I got a photo of her shaking her fist. She wasn't mad at me, but when the dam company had come in to estimate how many people would be displaced, they were doing it by household. And by the time the dam was built and they were getting their payments, her son was now, I don't know, early 20s and was going to be needing his own household because he'd just gotten married, but didn't have any money from the dam company to build that house. And so she was angry about that. Where's my compensation? Where's his compensation coming from? So they made some strides in addressing those compensation levels. I mentioned a while ago there's a deep bench of STEM manufacturing, STEM education, manufacturing, and construction expertise in China. The Chinese government believes strongly that that is the way to be ready for the 21st century, and I tend to agree. There's been a pragmatic approach, first popularized by Deng Xiaoping, who came into power after Mao in 78, who was famous for this crossing the river by feeling for stones, making it up as you go along kind of thing. But in the end, claiming credit for it as the CCP, saying, yeah, this is what we meant to do all along. And it's worked. China still owns a third of emissions, annual, if not more, global emissions. Some of those emissions can be tied to the export economy that fills our Walmart shelves. But many of those emissions are due to economic activities in China that stay in China. So that's the left graph there. The right one, if you look at per capita numbers, for a long time it was a pretty striking difference in per person emissions, CO2 emissions, compared when you looked at China versus the United States. The United States, we emitted a lot more than the average Chinese citizen did. Those numbers are trending the wrong way. Chinese emissions per capita are going up, and that will probably continue to be the case for a while. So takeaways, China's leaders have invested heavily in building an energy system for tomorrow. They've got receipts to show for it. They've got results to show for it. Like I said, they're no longer rolling blackouts that affect even the heart of China's manufacturing centers like they did in the early 2000s. China's leading photovoltaics and batteries and rare earth refining and EVs, clean energy installation, and I would add AI will almost certainly grow. Software, in the sense of markets, lags behind the hardware. So China's really good at building stuff. The Chinese government is not so good, and Chinese state-owned enterprises are not so good at changing processes and procedures. And so they've been really reluctant to allow wholesale electricity markets where things like low carbon electricity resources could compete on sort of fair terms with coal-fired power plants that are important to keep running because they employ a whole lot of people, and all of a sudden shutting down the economy of provinces heavily dependent on coal could be very disruptive. And then, another takeaway, not the greatest one. China still heavily invests in fossils, domestic coal, Russian oil, imported gas. And even as it builds some of those power plants right now, some of those, I guess, risk becoming stranded assets, if they're abandoned in 20 years due to cheaper alternatives in the renewables world. I'll stop there. happy to take questions, and I will try to juggle the online audience. I see 3 questions there, but those are probably folks telling me, yep, to share my screen. Okay. Anyway, questions? Yes. That's right. Would you repeat the question, please? Yes, I'll repeat the question. As a country, just to clarify that emissions slide, China emits more as a country. Where is that? Let me get back there. There you go. So the left chart showing that those annual CO2 emissions are outpacing the U.S. Emissions, but the per capita numbers China's per capita per person emissions numbers are creeping upward as those lifestyles shift, as Chinese people travel more, as they eat more meat, as they buy more stuff. Those per capita emissions are going up. Yep.
How much of the emissions per capita increase do you think we're going to see in the next decade can be attributed to the fact that the last 3 or 4 years China's seen for the first time a decrease in population?
It's a great question. Decrease in population growth rates is a significant question. The question is, how much will what will this emissions per capita number look like as China's population growth rate changes? Can I paraphrase it like that? That is more math than I can do in my head while trying to manage this. But I think I'm not a demographer. I think the expectations for Chinese population starting to decline are 2040-ish, but I don't hold me to that. I know the growth rates right now are below replacement rate. And so a country that from 1981 to 2015 was famous for the one-child policy. A lot of people think that was Mao. That wasn't Mao. That came after Mao died. Mao was famous for believing that more people and promoting the idea that more people meant a stronger country. That even as the 3 decades when Mao was in power, grain production was essentially stagnant for 3 decades. So Deng Xiaoping, one-child policy, 1981, with some exceptions for certain ethnic minority groups or the children. If both parents were single children, then they could have 2 children. But otherwise, there were penalties for having more than one child. Now the Chinese government is desperately trying to encourage people to have more kids. And so far includes some phenomenally invasive things like monitoring women's monthly cycles and such. Phenomenally invasive things. To not much effect so far, at least that I've seen. But I have no idea how this will shake out in terms of per capita emissions. It's a great question. Roy, did you back of the napkin that for me just now?
Just looking at the most data from all rolling data that goes to 2024, just one more year. There's still not 2025 data out yet. But 2024 data already, you can see that the slope is flattening out. That is pretty flat between 23 to 24. So you can already see that the emissions are seemingly copying.
The emissions per capita or emissions total? Okay.
The slope seems pretty flat for both of them.
Okay, so right. So a colleague, my colleague just pointed out, for those of you online, my colleague just pointed out that my graphs here on this slide stop at 2023. He's looked at the 2024 data, and both China's total emissions and per capita emissions are starting to level off. It's hard to say whether that's a trend yet or not, but that's good to know. Let me check online, see if there are other Anything else? Oh, there's some Q&As there. What fraction of China's petroleum has it been getting from Iran? I think 17% is the figure I've seen recently. Was it Iran and Venezuela? That's right. No, okay, right. So right. What is it? Roughly all of Iran's exported oil went to China. Well, like 90, up to 90% in recent years. But that fraction in terms of China's total oil imports, yeah, was less than 15%, I think. It's major sources Saudi Arabia and Russia. I'm pretty certain. What are the 2 or 3 best sources in English to keep informed about China's energy world? Great question, Tony. Thanks for that. One of our advancement board members. There used to be, there's a great website called Dialogue Earth. It was founded, it used to be China Dialogue. It was founded by a British journalist named Isabel Hinton. I can't remember, it's Hilton or Hinton. I can't remember which one. And it's now Dialogue Earth. So they do some great work, much of which is focused on China, partly because of the organization's history, partly because of the China is the energy story these days. And a second one, I guess I look at IEA a fair bit. And World Bank data. I do dig around in the Chinese sources once in a while, but unfortunately, and Froy, you've probably seen this as well, a lot of stuff that 10 years ago was not off limits, was not off limits, is now off limits to foreign users. Even, I've come to some sites where even if I put in a cell phone number and whatnot, I still can't get access to the data. So the Chinese government has gone the absolute opposite of transparency in recent years with data of all sorts, things that we used to take for granted for being to get energy data. And the last one, how are they paying for all this? That is a great question. China has a lot of they have a lot of foreign currency reserves. They have a lot of savings from Chinese citizens. Chinese citizens have relatively few opportunity or outlets for investment. In aside from the real estate market and yes, a stock market, but average Chinese citizens tend to save at a very high rate, and those savings, at least as I'm not an economist. I have a colleague, actually a friend from a long time ago, named Andrew Batson. He's a consultant for BATSON, consultant for Gavekal Economics, I think it is, and he does excellent work on the Chinese infrastructure development. Columbia and maybe NYU also both have some English language energy data available. Another question here in the audience, Mr. Howard.
Adopting, adapting, and perfecting foreign technology. Obviously, they now are leading in energy technology. When the U.S. is ready to have a sensible energy policy again, what are the lessons the best lesson for us to draw from their experience so we could stand on their shoulders when we're ready to stand up again?
Boy, that's a great question. China, I'll repeat it for those online. The question was, China has been great at adopting, adapting, and perfecting a lot of technologies initially developed elsewhere. When and if the U.S. moves to a point of having a more sensible energy policy, what lessons might we learn from China in order to sort of stand on the shoulder of that giant? That's a great question. The first that comes to mind is fund basic science and don't cut funding for the science in its broadest sense that underpins that development. And when I say in its broadest sense, I mean everything from particle physics to sociology, because if you build, one of the biggest problems right now in building energy facilities of any sort is social acceptance. Well, I don't want to store that nuclear waste there. I don't want to see those solar panels there. I'm happy to have a coal-fired power plant 1,000 kilometers away where I don't know about it. But if you're talking about putting wind turbines on my horizon, I don't know about that. I guess lesson number one, and this isn't something that the Chinese government has, the social science piece isn't something that the Chinese government has really invested in. If you're not happy with the impacts, oh well, tough luck. But fund that STEM education, nurture it from day one. Industrial parks where you have, you say, look, this is a national priority, and not so much that we need a 5-year plan in this country, but to recognize that energy independence based on, the alternative to whale oil is what's going to carry us forward in the 21st century. That doesn't make any sense. Energy independence based on free and abundant sunshine, driving solar energy, driving wind energy. Energy independence is, hey, look, we can drill a hole in the ground and take advantage of the fact that there's some warmth below the ground that doesn't change, or some cooling below the ground that doesn't change over the course of the year. Those technologies, I guess, embracing the innovation that is proven. We're not talking about fusion. We're not talking about things that are around the corner. We're talking about technologies that are here right now. And if it works, do it, right? I mean, we found those stones. Let's cross that river. How's that for poetry? That's not a very poetic answer to your question, but it's all I got. But fundamentally, invest. Don't pull back money from education, I would say. It's easy for me to say that on my pulpit right here on the campus of a university, but I believe at my core. What else? Yeah.
In that solar farm picture, it clearly used a lot of land. How is China on using already developed areas on building hubs?
Great question. So the question was about the solar farm picture that was using a lot of land. I read something the other day about tea farmers in the province where I spent most of my time doing research on hydropower, and this could well be in that province, because Yunnan province looks a lot like this. It's 94% mountains. It's China's Colorado kind of thing. So I read an article that was, the question is, how, sorry, I'll repeat the question for those online. How good are China's solar developers at using land that's already developed? Maybe marginal, rather than paving farmland or paving forest to put up solar panels. And this certainly looks like formerly, I would say tea plantations. And the article I was reading was about tea farmers who had seen land that they were using to farm tea in a part of the country that's very well suited for farming tea, seeing that land taken over for solar farms because officials were heavily incentivized to put solar panels out there. And so, I remember being blown away in the early 90s when I first started going to China about how ubiquitous solar thermal hot water heaters were on rooftops. If you couldn't orient yourself in China because the air was too polluted, you just had to look at and you couldn't tell which way where the sun was. It was just kind of this diffuse orangish light. You look on the rooftops at which way the solar thermal panels were facing. They're always facing south. So for a long time, China has, it's very low tech. Put black pipes under the sun. Guess what? They get warm. But run water through it. The water gets warm. So for a long time, they've done that. Right now, I mean, a lot of the solar development, the big solar and wind development that's happening is happening in what the Chinese government would classify as wasteland, desert ecosystems, deserts, right? Where nobody lives there. Nobody lives there. I mean, we know that there's something from an ecosystem perspective. There's something going on. There will be impacts. But so this makes for quite a photo, but a lot of the biggest developments are indeed happening in, I would say, less productive land. Anybody else? Yeah.
On that same note, are they, for example, putting photovoltaics up as shade structures in parking lots, covering the real roofs?
Are there photovoltaics being built in that double as shade structures? I would almost, yes, I would guarantee there are some. Do I have any sense of how much, what percentage? I don't know. I mean, I had to hazard a guess. I'd say 10% because most of them are being, the really like the gigawatt scale solar farms are just being built on vast tracts of desert or marginal land.
So they seem more interested in building mega projects than
Yep.
use good set.
I mean, more interested in. I would the title the title of my talk was all of the above, right? So those mega projects are the one that make the headlines. Those mega projects are the one that make the headlines in China and around the world. But there is a lot of village solar happening on rooftops that it just doesn't make the headlines. One last question. Let me check online. Oh, looks like the online questions are good. All right. Well, I'll close it with that. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for the good questions, and good luck learning more about China. It's a fascinating place.